Hello, my dear friends. Today I'm talking about Horary astrology and especially about when to not ask questions. To understand when not to put question, you need to spend a little time with the people who built this system. The classical authors weren't making up ethical guidelines because they were moralists. The classical authors record what they had observed over decades of practice. Certain kinds of questions produce unreliable charts. Certain kinds of queries don't get reliable readings. Guido Bonatti, the 13th century Italian astrologer, and one of the most important figures in medieval horary tradition, wrote in his Liber Astronomae about what he called considerations before judgment. These were a checklist of conditions an astrologer should assess before even attempting to read a horary chart. Several of these conditions were present. Bonatti argued the astrologer should be very cautious about pronouncing judgment, and in some cases should refuse to do so at all. William Lilly expanded on this tradition, and his considerations before judgment remain the foundational ethical and technical checklist of English language horary astrology. Among the conditions he flagged as problematic, the moon being void of course, the ascendant being in the first or last few degrees of a sign, Saturn is in the 7th house, and so on. Each of these, he argued, was a signal from the chart itself that something about the question or the timing was off. The classical practitioners believed that when a question was somehow ill-formed or inappropriate, when the timing was wrong, or the person wasn't ready to receive an answer, or the question was being asked out of anxiety rather than genuine need, the chart would show it. Later practitioners like John Frawley, Barbara Dunn, and Olivia Berkeley brought these classical principles back into modern practice. Frawley, particularly, has been talking about the importance of what he calls strictures against judgment, the technical signals in the chart that warn an astrologer away from attempting a reading. His work makes clear that these aren't optional cautious. They are part of the grammar of the language. Not all modern horary practitioners interpret the classical strictures in the same way. Some astrologers treat them as absolute prohibitions. If the moon is void of course, full stop, you cannot read the chart. Others treat them as warning flags that call for extra caution in interpretation. Some other practitioners, particularly those working outside the strictly classical tradition, may weight these conditions differently. What I want to do instead is give you a working framework that is both faithful to the classical tradition and useful in modern practice. There are some things that you have to take care about. The moon is void of course. It means that no applying aspects before changing signs. The ascendant or midheaven is in Via Combusta, between 15 degrees Libra and 15 degrees Scorpio. The ascendant is in the first 3 degrees or last 3 degrees of the sign. Saturn is in the 7th house, problematic for the astrologer's judgment. The moon is in the last degrees of a sign. The chart ruler is retrograde or combust. The querent does not match the ascendant description. Let's talk about void of course moon. So it's when she makes no applying aspects to any planet before leaving her current sign. In traditional astrology, this is considered one of the most significant indicators in Horary and one of the most debated. The classical judgment is nothing will come of the matter, so things will not develop. The situation is in stasis or will simply not proceed. But some modern practitioners argue that a void moon chart can still be read in certain circumstances, particularly when the matter being asked about is already in motion and will indeed reach completion regardless of new action. And there is something to that, but as a general rule, a void of course moon is the chart's way of saying this question doesn't have traction. Whatever is being asked about is not going anywhere significant. And in many cases, this corresponds to a question that was asked out of anxiety rather than genuine need. When it's about early or late ascendant. So when we have ascendant force in the first 3 degrees of the sign, classical tradition says the matter is too early, not yet ripe for examination. Either the question hasn't fully crystallized or the situation being asked about hasn't developed enough for the answer to be meaningful. When the ascendant falls in the last 3 degrees of sign, the matter may be already decided, already too far advanced for the chart to say anything useful about the situation. Both of these conditions tend to appear in questions that are asked prematurely or before the circumstances are defined enough to support a clear answer. When it's about Saturn in the 7th house, in classical horary, the 7th house represents the astrologer, the one rendering judgment. Saturn in the 7th is traditionally read as a warning for the astrologer. Proceed with caution, your judgment may be clouded, you may be bringing your own ideas or issues to this chart. For self-read horaries, where you are both querent and astrologer, this is particularly worth heeding. Saturn in your own 7th house may be telling you that your judgment about this question is compromised. This is a deeply psychological observation built into an astrological tradition from the 17th century, and it holds up remarkably well in modern practice. Let's see when not to ask a question. First is when you already know the answer. Okay, seems obvious, but it's violated constantly, particularly by people new about horary. If you already know the answer, if the situation is objectively clear, if the facts are in front of you and you simply don't like what they are telling you, casting a horary chart is not seeking wisdom, it's seeking permission, it's hoping the stars will tell you something different from what really is already saying. Sometimes the chart will oblige, not because the cosmos is lying to you, but because what you know may be less certain than you think. But more often, when someone already knows the answer and asks anyway, they are not really asking a horary question. They are asking a very different one. Is there any possible version of this situation where things turn out the way I want them to? And the question, while very human and very understandable, is not a horary one. Before you cast a horary chart, ask yourself, if the chart showed the opposite of what I'm hoping for, would I accept it? If the honest answer is probably not, then you don't yet have a genuine horary question. You have an emotional situation that needs proceeding, not astrological consultation. The second is when the question is about a third party's private affairs. Asking, will my daughter be okay after her surgery? It's a legitimate expression of parental concern. Asking, is my neighbor having an affair? Is not asking, will my sick mother recover? Expresses genuine love and concern. But asking, is my coworker planning to leave the company? Is a surveillance dressed in astrological clothing. The classical tradition actually does allow for proxy charts. Charts cast for questions about third parties, but with important qualifications. The querent must have a genuine, legitimate stake in the matter. The question must be one that the third party would recognize as appropriate for the querent to ask. A parent asking about their children's health, a business partner asking about the company's prospects, a spouse asking whether their relationship will survive. These are legitimate ones. But a nosy neighbor, a jealous ex, or someone trying to get information about another person's private financial or romantic life, these are not. The practical test here is a good one. Would you be comfortable asking the same question to the person's face? Would they consider it as a reasonable thing for you to inquire about? If the answer is no, if the question is something the third party would consider an invasion of their privacy, then it should not be asked of the stars either. That's why even when I receive a question about somebody else, I request an acceptance from the third party, because it's the best way. The third situation is when you are in acute emotional crisis. The question must be clearly formed, genuinely felt, and asked from a place of at least relative stability. When you are in the middle of an acute emotional crisis, in the grip of an anxiety attack, or in the depth of grief, you are not in the right state to cast or receive a horary chart. And there are some reasons for that. In acute distress, the questions we ask tend to be garbled. They sound like one question, but they are actually several. Will I ever be happy again? Is not really a horary question. It's an expression of a pain. Should I have done something differently? It's often not genuinely seeking information about the past, but seeking either reassurance or punishment. The emotional noise makes it nearly impossible to formulate a clean, answerable horary question. Some practitioners believe that acute emotional states can distort the energy of the question itself, making the chart less reliable. Whether or not you find the persuasive, the practical reality is clear. Emotionally fluid querents tend to get readings that don't land cleanly and don't help them in the moment they need help. So it's good to wait until the acute phase passes, until the question can be asked from a place of genuine wanting to know rather than desperate needing it to be in a certain way. The fourth situation is when the outcome would damage you regardless. There are situations where receiving an answer is unlikely to serve you well. The clearest example is when someone is in a situation they cannot change and are asking horary not for guidance, but for the comfort of a certainty. Horary is more powerful as a decision-making tool, not a coping tool. When the decision has already been made and cannot be unmade, horary loses much of its practical value. This doesn't mean you can never ask about the outcome of an ongoing situation. Of course you can. And there are times when knowing the likely trajectory helps you prepare appropriately. But when the purpose of asking is essentially to manage anxiety about something unchangeable, the chart is being asked to do something it's not designed to do. The fifth situation is when you are testing Horary or the astrologer. This is a very funny situation. I cannot imagine why a person will pay money to test an astrologer. The problem here is that the querent is not actually invested in the answer. There's no real weight to the question. And without that weight, the question isn't truly formed in the way Horary requires. And testing is a form of conditional belief. And Horary doesn't operate well in that space of conditional belief. It requires you to be genuinely in relationship with the question, not evaluating the question from a detached experimental stance. The sixth situation is when the question concerns life or death in a morbid and non-necessary way. Questions about whether a sick person will recover, whether a dangerous journey will be survived, whether an elderly parent will make it through a medical crisis. These are legitimate Horary questions born of genuine human concerns. They are asked not out of morbid curiosity, but because of love, practical necessity, or the need to prepare. What is not appropriate is the morbid, curiosity-driven question about death. Something like, when will my parent die? Asked not out of care, but them or need to make a practical arrangements, but because you are curious or because inheritance is involved. Or another stupid question, will my boss die? Asked by someone who wants the person gone. Questions that are morbidly focused on one's own death tend to be asked from a very disturbed emotionally state, which brings us back to the crisis state category. A reasonable test for death-related questions is would this question be considered appropriate and compassionate if asked of a wise doctor, a trusted counselor, or a caring friend? If it would feel inappropriate, it's probably not an appropriate Horary questions either. The seventh situation is when you have no real investment in the outcome. This isn't about having to be desperately emotionally attached to every question you bring to Horary. You can ask calm, practical questions about everyday matters. You don't need to be in tears while you put the question, but there needs to be genuine relevance. Another situation, when it's about to repeat the same question over and over. And this can happen. It's like you ask a question, you receive an answer, but you don't like the answer. You wait a few days or a few hours and ask again, hoping for a different result. All of these are a violation of Horary ethics, and all of them produce unreliable results. The classical tradition is clear. A question can only be asked once. Why is this rule? Because Horary is not a negotiation. You don't go to keep some meeting proposals until the heavens agreed to your terms. The chart that comes up when you first genuinely, sincerely ask the question, this is the chart. It represents the true state of the matter at the moment of genuine inquiry. You must understand that in Horary astrology, the rules exist not to keep you from accessing the art, but to keep the art accessible, to preserve its integrity, to maintain its reliability, to ensure what when you do ask. You get an answer that means something. So if you have a question, you can order a horary chart interpretation. I will let you the link down below. I wish you all the best. Take care of you. Bye bye.